Clara stepped out of the car, and the cold, dead silence of the landscape swallowed her whole. It wasn't the biting chill of the wind or the oppressive gray sky overhead. It was something else. A feeling. A presence. Something was wrong here, something alive in the stillness, watching her. Her breath formed visible clouds in the air, but the moment she exhaled, it was as if the wind tried to steal it from her, sucking the warmth from her chest in an unnatural way. She stared at the looming building in front of her, a jagged silhouette against the broken horizon, its shape too harsh, too unnatural. The air here felt dense, almost too thick to breathe properly. The lab looked abandoned, like a tomb. It had no windows, at least none that she could see, just a fortress of cold industrial concrete that seemed to absorb any warmth, any life around it. But the door was open, and then she heard it, a low, guttural sound, a hum coming from inside the building. Not a sound from the outside world. It was something other, a vibration that rattled in her chest, deep and disturbing. It didn't belong here, and it definitely didn't belong to her. Her legs froze to the ground. She was not supposed to be here. She shouldn't be here. But she had no choice. The whisper in the back of her mind, that nagging, insistent voice, told her to enter, told her it was too late to turn back. Her heart hammered in her chest, and her stomach turned as she approached the door. It slid open with a soft hiss, too smooth, too quiet. The sound scraped at her nerves, making the hairs on her neck stand on end. Inside was the starkest of contrasts, a laboratory that looked meticulously clean, almost sickeningly perfect. White walls, harsh lights that flickered and buzzed in unnatural rhythms, rows of equipment she didn't recognize. But something felt wrong, deeply, profoundly wrong. There were too many shadows, stretching in angles that defied logic. "Welcome to your new home," said a voice behind her, crisp and cold. Clara spun around, her pulse spiking as she found herself face to face with Dr. Eamon Harrow, the lead researcher. His presence seemed to push the air even thicker, like he was a part of this strange, suffocating place. His eyes were dark, cold, and disinterested, scanning her face without a hint of emotion. "I trust you've read the rules." She could barely hear him over the deafening hum of the building. His words fell flat, like they didn't matter. She didn't answer, her mind too occupied with the strange, unseen weight pressing on her chest. "Follow them," Harrow continued, his voice just a bit too sharp. He stepped aside and motioned toward a steel door that slid open silently. Clara felt an unsettling sensation wash over her as she entered the room. The walls were lined with glass, reflecting her own nervous face in fragmented angles. She could hear her breathing, ragged and uneven, as she approached the observation area. And then she saw it. Subject X. At first, it was nothing more than a blur, something that flickered in and out of focus, a shape that seemed to constantly change, shifting like smoke caught in the wind. Her eyes couldn't focus, couldn't lock onto it. One moment it looked like a man, and then, no, it was something else, something more alien. A face twisted, fluid, grotesque. Eyes that weren't eyes, but endless, shifting holes that swallowed the light. Clara took a step back, but her feet felt glued to the floor. She couldn't tear her gaze away. Her breath caught in her throat as she noticed the way its form seemed to watch her, its shape knowing her. It was aware. It was looking at her through the glass. The air in the room felt impossibly cold. She could feel her heart beating faster, harder, as if her very body were trying to warn her. There was a whisper, soft, almost imperceptible. She thought it was the wind or the building creaking under its own weight, but it was too alive, too personal. Clara Vaylor. The whisper was so faint, so close. It wasn't just in her ears, it was inside her head. It was in her soul. She spun around. There was no one behind her. The lab was empty, save for the thing inside the containment unit. Her chest tightened. The whispers, were they from it? Her mind raced, but she could hear nothing but that soft, hollow voice repeating her name. Her heart pounded. Her knees shook, but she couldn't move. She felt paralyzed by the pull of the sound. "Clara?" The voice came again, as if it had been waiting for her to listen. Clara Vaylor. Her name, dripping with an inhuman familiarity. Clara's hand trembled as she reached for the door handle to leave the room, but as soon as her fingers touched the cold metal, the whisper stopped. The room fell deathly silent. The hum that had been so constant before, gone. It was as if the lab had just held its breath. A sharp voice broke the silence. "Don't," Theo Drake, the lab technician, warned, his eyes wide and panicked. He was standing at the doorway, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "You don't hear it, do you? You don't listen, never listen." Clara's pulse raced, her mind spun with confusion. Listen to what? What was happening here? Why had he warned her? What was inside the lab that knew her name? Before she could speak, a cold, unblinking gaze from Dr. Harrow made her stop. "Remember the rules," he said almost too calmly, as if he were reading from a script. "Never look into its eyes. Never speak when it calls your name." Clara's throat tightened. What had she just heard? As she turned, her eyes locked onto Subject X again. Its shape flickered, and this time it wasn't just in her head. It was real. It was alive, and it was watching her. The whispers returned, louder, clearer, like a crescendo building to something horrifying. "Clara Valor." The second day at the lab felt worse than the first. Clara's nerves were frayed, but she forced herself to stay calm. It wasn't just the eerie silence that unsettled her. It was the feeling that something was wrong, like an invisible weight pressing on her chest. The lab hummed steadily with the sound of its ventilation system, a low, monotonous drone that echoed through the sterile hallways. It made her feel as though the building was alive in some twisted, unnatural way. As the morning passed, the tension only grew. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her. Her first task of the day was to observe Subject X. But this wasn't a normal creature. Clara knew that much. No one had told her exactly what it was, but the vague warnings had been enough to keep her on edge. She had seen it in the containment room the day before, and even though it had been there, it had never quite felt present. It flickered, constantly shifting. Its form was so distorted that it seemed to exist between one shape and another. There were moments when Clara thought she saw something in its eyes, an intelligence that didn't belong. The thought made her stomach turn, but she tried to push it aside. Her new supervisor, Dr. Hazel Quinn, gave her a cool smile as Clara took her place at the observation panel. Hazel's calmness was unnerving. She never seemed worried or unsettled. Clara wasn't sure why, but she felt like Hazel wasn't just distant. She was detached. Hazel's voice was smooth, measured. "Let me know if you notice anything unusual," she said, her tone so casual it felt out of place. Clara nodded, her throat tight. She didn't trust herself to speak. Across the room, Celia Morin, the lab assistant, was sorting through papers. Her hands shook slightly as she worked. At first, it wasn't obvious, but Clara could tell something was wrong. Celia had been jittery all day, her eyes darting around as though expecting someone, or something, to appear behind her. When their eyes met, Clara saw it. Fear. Not the normal kind of fear. This was deeper. It was the kind of fear you feel when you know you're being hunted. Clara's task seemed straightforward. She was supposed to document the creature's behavior, track its movements, and note any changes she observed. But nothing about this felt simple. Every time she looked at Subject X through the observation glass, she noticed something strange. One moment, it appeared as a mass of shifting shadows. The next, it took on a form she couldn't quite recognize. Was it human? Animal? Something else entirely? She couldn't tell, and the uncertainty was gnawing at her. The creature's behavior was inconsistent. Sometimes it would become eerily still, as though waiting for something. Other times, it would shift violently, like a sudden burst of motion caught at the edge of her vision. But it wasn't just changing shapes. It was changing something else too. Clara couldn't explain it, but the longer she watched it, the more it felt like something was shifting inside her mind. Celia came over to her desk in the observation room, her face pale, eyes wide. She whispered, barely audible over the hum of the ventilation system. "It's not just changing shapes, it's changing minds too." Clara froze, her pen still in her hand. She didn't understand at first what Celia meant, what she was implying. Was she talking about the creature's ability to manipulate thoughts? Or was she suggesting something darker, something Clara wasn't ready to face? The words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Celia leaned in closer, her voice trembling. "I don't think you should be here, Clara," she said, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "It wants you. It knows who you are. It's been watching, all of us." Clara's mind raced. Was Celia just paranoid, or was there some truth in her words? The creature was strange, unnervingly so, but could it really do what Celia claimed? Clara didn't know, but a sick, twisting feeling settled in her gut. She didn't want to believe it, yet the unease wouldn't leave her. She turned her attention back to the observation window. The creature was still now, its form flickering faintly between one shadow and another. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that it was looking at her. But that was impossible, wasn't it? The glass should have made it impossible for it to know she was there. And yet, she couldn't stop herself from staring. She knew the rules. Don't look too long. Don't let it draw you in. But her eyes stayed locked on its shifting form. It felt alive in a way that made her skin crawl. And then she saw them. Its eyes. No one had told her about the eyes. They weren't just dark. They were endless, deep and knowing. They stared at her, unblinking, as if it understood something about her that even she didn't. The air in the room grew colder, sharp and biting. Clara shivered, her breath visible in the sudden chill. Her fingers trembled as she gripped her pen, unable to look away. And then in the stillness, the creature did something she couldn't comprehend. It smiled. The expression was subtle, almost imperceptible, a curl of something that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't human, but it was unmistakable. It was a smile of knowledge, of recognition, as though it knew exactly what she was thinking. And then it disappeared, fading into the darkness of its cell. Clara's heart raced, her breathing shallow. She scribbled notes with shaking hands, her mind struggling to make sense of what she'd seen. The rules existed for a reason, and she had broken them. That night, as Clara walked back to her quarters, the air felt heavier than usual. The hallway was dimly lit, shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls. She tried to shake the feeling, but the whispers came again, soft, faint, like a breeze brushing against her ear. Clara. She froze, spinning around. The hallway was empty. Her pulse quickened, her chest tightening. She told herself it was nothing, a trick of her imagination, maybe the hum of the ventilation, but the whisper came again, closer this time. Clara. Valor. Her name, spoken in a voice that wasn't quite human. She turned sharply, her heart pounding, and saw Celia standing at the end of the corridor. Celia's face was pale, her expression blank, her eyes wide, as if she had seen something she couldn't understand. "Celia?" Clara called out, relief washing over her. But Celia didn't respond. She stared at Clara as if she were a stranger. "It's me, Clara," she said, her voice shaking. Do you remember?" "I'm sorry," Celia interrupted, her voice flat, detached. "I don't know you." The words hit Clara like a blow. She stared at Celia, searching her face for some sign of recognition, but there was nothing. Her gaze was empty, her tone devoid of emotion. A chill ran down Clara's spine. This wasn't a joke. It couldn't be. Something had happened to Celia, something she couldn't explain. The whispers grew louder, clearer, as if they were coming from the walls themselves. The temperature dropped again, and Clara could feel the cold sinking into her bones. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The whispers surrounded her, suffocating, pressing against her mind. Something was coming for her, something that had already begun to change her. The lab was darker now, the once bright fluorescent lights flickering sporadically, casting long, strange shadows that danced just beyond Clara's line of sight. The air felt thicker, more oppressive, as if the building itself were breathing in sync with her every move. She tried to focus on the task at hand, but the feeling of being watched by something unseen, something that knew exactly where she was, made it nearly impossible to concentrate. She had no idea who or what it was, but the sensation clung to her like a second skin. The whispers had only grown louder in the last few days, haunting her thoughts, following her footsteps, filling the empty spaces when no one else was around. Each time she tried to brush it off, the whispers would return, tugging at her sanity. It wasn't just the creature, though. Clara had begun to realize something was wrong with the people here, too. Their eyes, their expressions, the way they moved. It all felt off. They were becoming different, and she was starting to wonder if she was too. That night, as she passed through the narrow hallways, she found herself turning into the break room, half expecting to find someone. Instead, there was only a voice, one that came from the shadows, hushed and raspy, almost unrecognizable. "Clara," it whispered, and Clara's breath hitched. She spun around, heart pounding, only to find Dr. Elias Thorne standing in the corner of the room. He hadn't been there moments ago, but now he was, his frail figure hunched and trembling as he muttered to himself. His disheveled hair, pale skin and empty eyes made him look less like a man and more like something broken, something lost. He wasn't looking at her when he spoke, but his voice carried an unnatural weight. It was like he wasn't really talking to anyone at all, just spilling out fragments of his fractured mind. His words weren't clear, and they didn't seem to make sense, but Clara found herself unable to look away. "It changes everything," he said, his voice hollow. "Not just its form, it changes reality. People, places, time, the creature. It replaces things. It becomes them, everything, and everyone." Clara took a step back, her pulse quickening. She wasn't sure if Thorn was talking about Subject X or if he was talking about something worse. She could see the madness in his eyes, the way his body trembled as if he was trying to hold on to his thoughts, but they were slipping away like sand through his fingers. His hands shook violently as he looked at Clara, his eyes wide with panic. "You're here now," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "It's too late. Once you've been touched, there's no leaving. It takes you. It becomes you." Clara felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She wanted to leave. She wanted to get as far away from him and from the creature as possible. But something held her there. The lab, the people, everything had become a tangled mess of confusion and dread. She didn't understand any of it, but she was already too deep to walk away. Thorn's words echoed in her mind as she tried to make sense of the situation. What was he talking about? What did he mean when he said it became people? Was he speaking metaphorically, or was there something more to it? Was Subject X more than just a shape-shifting creature? Could it really replace people? Become them? Clara needed answers. She had to find out what was going on before it was too late. When Thorn suddenly stopped speaking and turned to leave, Clara followed him, feeling the weight of his warnings pressing on her chest. As she made her way down the corridor, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, something she couldn't see but knew was there. She turned a corner and entered Thorn's office, hoping to find something that could explain the chaos. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of dust and old paper. There, on his desk, was a journal, a small leather-bound book that looked like it hadn't been touched in months. Clara reached for it, her hands trembling as she flipped open the cover. The pages inside were filled with a strange mixture of incoherent ramblings, scribbled notes, and fragmented thoughts. It was the kind of writing someone might make if they were losing their grip on reality. But there was something about it that felt important. She skimmed through the pages, barely able to make sense of the disjointed words, until one particular passage caught her attention. It watches, and when you look away, it becomes you. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The words were like a slap to her face. What did it mean? It sounded like a warning, but what was it warning her about? Was it talking about Subject X, or was there something else? She read the passage again, her eyes wide as she tried to piece together the meaning. The creature, the whispers, the way it changed, it was all connected. But how? What was it trying to do? As she closed the journal, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The shadows grew longer, and a cold presence filled the air, like something was just on the edge of her perception, waiting. She turned quickly, expecting to see Thorn standing behind her, but the room was empty. For a moment, she stood still, her heart pounding. Then she felt it, a tap on her shoulder. It was light, almost gentle, but it sent a jolt of fear straight to her core. She whipped around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one there. The room felt suddenly darker, the air thick with a presence she couldn't name. "Clara?" The whisper came from behind her, but it wasn't Thorn's voice. It wasn't anyone's voice she recognized. It was cold, distant, and somehow wrong. It was familiar, but it wasn't. The voice echoed in her ears, and her stomach twisted in dread. Clara Vaylor. Her breath caught. The voice, the whisperer, it was calling her name again. But it wasn't like before. This time, the voice wasn't Thorn's. It wasn't anyone she knew. It was something else, something that had already come inside her. She spun around, but Thorn was gone. The room was empty, the silence oppressive. There was only the sound of her own breathing, shallow and frantic. And then she felt it. A shift in the air. Something was different. Something inside her had changed. The whisperer wasn't just in the room anymore. It was in her, and it was never going to let her leave. The lab was no longer a place of order. It had become a maze, a twisted nightmare where nothing made sense. The walls seemed to bend and shift when Clara wasn't looking, and the floors creaked underfoot in ways that felt unnatural, like the building itself was alive and watching her. Every turn led to another strange hallway. Doors that should have opened to familiar spaces instead revealed empty rooms, or worse, places she didn't remember seeing before. She couldn't even trust the layout of the lab anymore. Nothing felt right, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the building itself was playing tricks on her mind, twisting reality to its will. The air was thick with fear. Clara's heart hammered in her chest as she wandered through the ever-changing hallways, desperate to find someone who could explain what was happening. But she was beginning to realize that no one in this place was who they appeared to be. The lab was full of people, but it wasn't full of people. She stumbled into Theo's workspace, the technician's paranoia now impossible to ignore. He was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself in a language Clara couldn't quite understand, his eyes darting around the room as if he were constantly looking for something or someone. His face, usually pale but controlled, was now a mask of sheer panic. "They've changed," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I've been watching them, Clara. They look the same, but they're not. Dr. Harrow, Lydia, even Marcus, they're all different. They're not who they say they are. Subject X is inside them now, and I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending I don't see it." Clara's stomach turned. She didn't want to believe him. She couldn't. But Theo's words echoed in her mind, gnawing at her sanity. She had seen the changes, felt the shifts in behavior in the way the others acted. It was subtle at first, small things that could have been easily ignored. But now, those small things were building into something too big to dismiss. Clara felt her reflection in a hallway mirror, an odd, distorted version of herself. Her face didn't look right. Her eyes were too wide, too empty, like she wasn't even seeing herself. She blinked, and the reflection blinked too, but something about it didn't match the way she moved. She tried to shake off the creeping dread. It was just a trick of the mind, a symptom of too much stress, she told herself. But the doubts only grew. It wasn't just her reflection. The others had begun acting strange. Things they said, the way they moved, the tone in their voices. It was all wrong. Dr. Harrow had been different since the day she arrived, but now it felt like the changes were happening to everyone. People she had once trusted, colleagues who had seemed so normal, were now behaving in ways that made Clara's skin crawl. The worst part was that Clara couldn't even trust her own mind. She couldn't tell what was real anymore, and the lab was playing tricks on her. She wasn't sure if it was the creature's influence or if something far worse was happening to her. Was she losing herself? Was she changing too? Clara's heart raced as she turned a corner, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could offer reassurance. Instead, she saw Dr. Harrow standing in front of her, blocking the hallway. He was alone, but his eyes, they weren't right. They were too calm, too empty. A false warmth in his voice that she didn't remember. "Clara," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "You look troubled. What's going on?" Her gut twisted. This wasn't Dr. Harrow. It couldn't be. His eyes didn't hold the weight of the person she'd met. There was something wrong, something alien in the way he spoke, in the way his lips curled into that forced smile. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She felt a creeping unease, the sense that whatever was standing in front of her wasn't just imitating Dr. Harrow, it was pretending to be him. Clara's mind screamed to run, to escape, but her body refused to obey. "Clara, you've been chosen," the figure before her said, the words oozing with an unsettling calmness. "I've been waiting for you. You've broken the rules, and now it's time to take your place." Clara froze, her breath trapped in her chest. It wasn't him. It wasn't Dr. Harrow. The creature was wearing his face, mimicking his voice. But it wasn't him. It couldn't be. It wasn't human anymore. The way it stood there, so unmoving, so still, made her want to scream. "You've seen the signs, haven't you?" it continued, its voice a perfect imitation of Harrow's, though Clara could hear the slight distortion in the words. "You've seen them change. You've seen me change. You've watched as we became more like what we truly are." It took a step closer to her, and Clara's feet felt rooted to the floor. Subject X doesn't just take shape. It takes everything. Memories, personalities, lives. It becomes them, and now it's becoming you. Clara stumbled back, terror flooding her veins. She couldn't move. The creature's words settled in her mind like a poison, a cold, creeping realization taking hold. This thing had been mimicking Dr. Harrow for longer than she had even known. It wasn't just the creature shifting forms. It had replaced him, taken his identity, his memories. It was more than just a shapeshifter. It was something worse. "You can't run," the creature in Harrow's form said, its smile growing wider, the teeth sharp, unnatural. "I've been here all along, watching, waiting, becoming." Clara's breath caught in her throat, and she turned to run, but the creature's hand shot out faster than she could react. It grabbed her arm, pulling her into the air, its grip like iron. Her heart pounded as she struggled, but the creature's eyes, those empty, cold eyes, held her in place. "You won't leave," it whispered, its voice dropping lower, darker. "There's no leaving once I've become you. I am you, and you are me." Clara's mind screamed for her to wake up, to break free from whatever twisted nightmare this was. But she couldn't. She was already a part of it. And as she looked into its eyes, she realized something far worse. The creature wasn't just replacing people. It was taking them, piece by piece, until nothing was left of the original. And she, Clara, was the next one to vanish. The lab's once familiar hum had become a low, unsettling drone, echoing through the halls like the sound of a distant, forgotten heartbeat. The air felt colder now, as though the walls themselves were closing in on Clara, pushing her closer to the edge of sanity. Time, too, had begun to warp. It was as if the hours stretched out into an endless loop, every hallway twisting further than it should. It was always the same, yet it was never the same. The lab had become a place where time lost its meaning, and every corner felt like a trap. Clara's mind was slipping, and she could feel it. The paranoia gnawed at her, turning every shadow into something dangerous. Her own footsteps seemed too loud, too harsh against the silence. Every sound felt like it was being magnified, every movement exaggerated. Her reflection no longer made sense. When she passed the mirrors, it was as if the person staring back at her wasn't quite her. The eyes were wrong. The posture was wrong. She didn't know who she was anymore. The fear began to take hold of her, drowning her in a sea of confusion. She had found Celia once again, but this time, the assistant was far more distant, her eyes wide and vacant, as though she had lost herself in some abyss. Her hands trembled as she held a journal, no longer a simple record of events, but a collection of strange symbols and broken sentences. It didn't make any sense, not in the way a journal should. The ink swirled and twisted in patterns that felt wrong, like the pages were written by someone or something that didn't belong in this world. "They're all changing," Celia murmured, her voice soft, but the words came in a strange, distorted rhythm. "We have to document everything, Clara. Every shift, every change. We're all part of it now. We are the experiment." Her gaze locked onto Clara, and there was something unsettling about the way she spoke, as though she was speaking to someone who wasn't there, someone only she could see. Clara's heart pounded as she tried to understand. What did Celia mean? How had they become part of the experiment? How had it all changed so quickly? The lab, the people, none of it made sense anymore. Clara had always thought she could trust her own memories, her own thoughts. But now she wasn't so sure. She couldn't trust the reflection in the mirror, and she couldn't trust her own feelings. The whispers, the ones she couldn't escape, seemed to be pulling at her, manipulating her thoughts, twisting her reality until nothing felt real anymore. It wasn't just Celia. The others, too, were becoming harder to recognize. She had seen Marcus in the hallway earlier, but something was wrong. He was standing still, as if waiting for her to approach. His face, his eyes, they were completely black, void of any light, like staring into an endless pit. He didn't speak. He didn't even blink. He just stared at her, unblinking, unfeeling. A chill ran through Clara as she stared back, unsure if she was looking at Marcus at all. Could it be him? Or was this another imitation by Subject X? Was this creature, this thing, mimicking everyone, taking their identities, their memories, and turning them into something else? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Her mind raced. Was she real anymore, or had she been replaced too? Every moment felt like a test, a trick. She couldn't tell where the real world ended and the nightmare began. How much of herself had been taken, altered, replaced? The shadows in the corners of the lab seemed to grow longer, their dark edges pulling at the corners of her mind, begging her to lose herself in them. The air was thick, suffocating, and her breaths came shallow as the walls seemed to press closer. It was as if the building itself was closing in, suffocating her. And then there was the whisper. The voice that had been haunting her since the day she stepped foot into the lab, always just behind her, just out of reach. Clara spun around, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was no one there. Just the empty hallway stretching on forever, just like the rest of the lab. She had to get out, but no matter which direction she turned, the same oppressive sense of dread followed her. The walls felt too close, the halls too long. She had no escape. Not from the lab, and not from the creeping madness that seemed to be consuming everyone and everything inside. She needed answers. She needed to know what was happening, what had happened to them. But as she turned back toward Celia, she saw something else, something that wasn't quite right. Celia's lips were moving again, but now the words were coming out in a strange, hollow, whispering tone. It wasn't the language she knew, wasn't even a language at all. The sounds, the syllables, twisted in the air, almost as if they were alive, breathing and shifting, becoming something else. The whispers spoke of things Clara couldn't understand. Was it a warning, or was it a sign that Celia herself had already been replaced? The terror took root deeper in Clara's chest. Her thoughts, her memories, were slipping away, fading, blending together. How much of what she saw was real, and how much of it was simply another trick of Subject X? Every corner, every reflection, every sound, it was all starting to feel like a game that had no rules, a game where she was the only one who didn't know how to play. Clara stumbled back, her hands reaching out to steady herself, but the walls felt as if they were shifting beneath her fingers. The fear was overwhelming, and she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The whispers were louder now, echoing through her mind. She had to escape. She had to get out before it consumed her completely. But she didn't know where to run. The halls led nowhere. And the more she tried to understand, the further she slipped into madness. Her eyes darted back to Marcus, standing at the end of the hallway. His black eyes stared at her with an unblinking intensity, as if waiting for her to make the wrong move. He didn't speak, didn't move. He was just there, like a shadow, like a memory that shouldn't exist. Clara's heart raced as she felt herself losing control, losing herself. Was she becoming like them? Was she becoming a part of whatever twisted reality the creature had created? The lab had become a nightmare, and she was trapped in it. The lines between reality and madness had blurred, and there was no escape. The lab had become a maze of horrors, every corridor twisted into another, and no matter how many doors Clara opened, they always led her back to the same place. The walls seemed to pulse around her as if they were alive, watching her every move. The air was thick, suffocating, and the coldness pressed in from all sides. It was like the building itself was trapping her, changing, rearranging itself just to keep her inside. There was no escape. Clara had tried. She had tried every exit, every hallway, but each one led her back to the heart of the labyrinth. The doors closed behind her with a low, ominous thud, as if they were mocking her. The walls creaked and groaned as if they were alive. And sometimes she swore she heard faint whispers coming from the cracks in the concrete, calling her name. She couldn't be sure if the whispers were real or just her mind snapping under the pressure. But they were always there, always just beyond her reach. She was losing her grip on reality, and with it, her hope. She had always thought the lab was a place for research, a place of knowledge and discovery. But now, it was something else entirely. It was like a living thing, constantly shifting and changing, as though it had its own will, its own desires. It wasn't just a building, it was a trap, and she was its prey. Then, there was Theo. Clara had noticed him more recently, his erratic behavior becoming harder to ignore. The lab technician, once so calm and collected, was now trembling, constantly glancing over his shoulder, as if something or someone was watching him. His eyes were wide, filled with fear, but there was something else there too. A sense of desperation, a look that told Clara he was losing control, just like everyone else. "I know a way out," he said one night, his voice shaky as he approached Clara. He looked around nervously, his eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to move at the corners of the room. "I've been preparing. I found a way to leave, to get out of this place." Clara's heart skipped a beat. Was this her chance? Had she finally found someone who knew how to escape? But then, doubt crept in. Could she trust Theo? Could she trust anyone here? He was as much a part of this nightmare as she was, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was just as lost as the rest of them. She didn't know if she could rely on him, or if he was leading her deeper into the trap. "I can show you," Theo continued, his voice low and almost pleading. "But you have to come with me now, before it's too late." Clara hesitated. She wanted to believe him, but fear gnawed at her. Every step she took in the lab seemed to take her further away from the truth, and closer to whatever horrible reality Subject X had created. She didn't trust the walls, didn't trust the doors, and certainly didn't trust Theo. But at that moment, she didn't have a choice. There was nothing left but to follow him, to see if the exit he promised was real or just another illusion. They moved through the lab together, Theo leading the way with a sense of urgency that matched Clara's own. The walls seemed to close in on them as they went, the air thick with the weight of what was happening. It felt like they were walking through a dream or a nightmare. And Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the whole lab was watching them, following them, waiting for them to make a mistake. They reached a door that Clara had never seen before. It was old and rusted, but the faintest glimmer of light slipped through the cracks around it. This had to be it, the exit, the way out. Her heart pounded in her chest as Theo pushed the door open, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw something beyond it. A wide, open field stretching out as far as the eye could see. The sky was dark, heavy with clouds, but it was real. It was the world outside, the world she had been desperate to escape to. But when she stepped through the door, something was wrong. She blinked, looking around, and the field seemed to stretch on forever. The lab was gone. There were no walls, no hallways, no strange pulsing corridors, just an empty, barren landscape that felt wrong. It was as though the entire world had shifted, twisted into something that didn't belong. The sky was too dark, the grass too still. There were no sounds of life, just silence, and the faintest whisper in the distance, calling her name. Where? Where is the lab? Clara muttered, her voice barely a whisper. She turned, looking back at the door, but it was gone. There was no sign of it, no sign of the building or of the people she had once known. She was alone in this strange, empty world, and something told her she would never find her way back. Theo was gone, too. She called his name, but no answer came. She was alone. The weight of what had happened, what was happening, crushed her chest. The creature, the lab, the twisted maze of reality and madness, it had all led her here, to this place. But this wasn't freedom. This was something worse. She had escaped the lab, yes, but only to find herself trapped in a new nightmare, one that felt even more suffocating than the last. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, as if the earth itself was alive, breathing, watching. And the whispers returned, louder now, echoing in her mind, swirling around her. "It's not over," they said. "It's never over." The creature was still with her, always watching, always waiting. And no matter how far she ran, she would never be free. The world outside the lab was nothing like the one Clara had known. It was twisted, unfamiliar, like a nightmare that stretched on forever. The sky was a sickly color, the ground cracked and uneven, and the trees were bent in unnatural angles, as if they had been pulled from the earth and twisted into grotesque shapes. There were no roads, no signs of life, just a barren, distorted landscape that seemed to go on forever. Time itself felt broken here. Every step she took felt like it was stretching the very fabric of reality, warping it in ways she couldn't understand. Clara had thought she escaped the lab. She thought she had gotten away from the creature, from the madness that had consumed everything. But now, as she wandered this strange world, something gnawed at the back of her mind. It wasn't real. None of it was. The air was too still, too heavy, and there was an oppressive weight pressing down on her, as if something was watching her every move. The whispers returned, faint at first, but they grew louder with each passing moment. They were inside her head again, tugging at her thoughts, twisting her memories. They were coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The ground beneath her feet began to shift, just like the walls of the lab had. She stumbled, falling to her knees as the earth seemed to pulse with life. It was as if the very landscape was alive, breathing, and it was slowly swallowing her whole. Clara's heart raced. She had to get out. She had to find a way to escape this place, but deep down, she knew she was already trapped. She had never left the lab. It had all been a lie, a sick, twisted illusion created by the creature. And then, she heard it. The Whisperer. Its voice, once distant, was now clear, right behind her. Clara spun around, her breath caught in her throat. It was standing there, not in the shadows anymore, but fully in front of her. It was no longer just a whisper in the air. It was something tangible, something real. And it wasn't just a voice, it was a presence, a force. It was the thing that had been pulling the strings all along, controlling every moment of Clara's life since she set foot in the lab. "You thought you escaped," the Whisperer said, its voice smooth and cold. "But there was never any escape for you. There was never any freedom." Clara's mind screamed in protest, but she couldn't deny it anymore. She had been running, thinking there was a way out, but there was nothing beyond the lab. There was no escape. The Whisperer had always been there, watching her, manipulating her every move. The world around her, the twisted landscape, the broken time, the distorted sky, wasn't real. It was all part of the creature's design, a reflection of its influence on her mind. "You're already inside me," the Whisperer continued, its voice almost playful now. "Your mind, your memories, your very body, they're mine. You've been a part of me all along. You just didn't know it." Clara felt her stomach churn. Her hands shook, and she pressed them to her head as if she could block out the horrifying truth. She had always thought the creature was something separate, something other, but it had been inside her the entire time. She was the creature now. She had become part of it, and it had become part of her. The lab, the people, the whispers, the creature's shifting forms, it had all been the same thing. It had been shaping her, shaping the world around her, bending reality to its will. "No," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "No, I'm not. I'm not part of you." The Whisperer smiled, a cruel, empty smile. "You always were, and now there's nothing left of you. You were the perfect subject, Clara. You broke the rules, and now you belong to me." Clara's heart pounded in her chest, and her vision blurred. She wanted to run, to escape, but there was no place left to run to. The world around her had already been swallowed by the creature, and there was no escape from it. It had already consumed her, and now it would continue to shape the world as it saw fit. The ground beneath her feet cracked open, and Clara fell, her body sinking into the earth. The Whisperer's laughter echoed in her mind, and she felt herself slipping, losing herself to it. The world dissolved around her, and she felt herself being absorbed, her thoughts, her memories, her very essence blending with the creature. There was no Clara anymore, only the creature, only the Whisperer. And in the final moments, Clara realized the terrifying truth. She had never been free. The creature had always been in control. It had always been a part of her, shaping her, molding her, and now it had won. It would continue to shape the world, to twist reality, and Clara would be lost, forever a part of it.